20 years ago, a baby was taken from a hospital room, and now, that same young man returns to his hometown, unaware of the life that was stolen from him. This is a story about loss, truth, and the power of family. Before we get started, please drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I can't wait to hear your stories. It was still dark outside when Sarah Whitmore opened her eyes to the soft beeping of a monitor and the dull ache in her body, reminding her that the day before had been both the most beautiful and the most exhausting of her life. March 12, 2005, the day her son, Ethan James Whitmore, had come into the world. Born just after midnight, screaming and healthy, with a shock of golden hair and a grip so strong it made the nurses laugh. She remembered how they'd wheeled him in after the initial checks, swaddled tight in a blue blanket, and how she hadn't taken her eyes off him for hours. But now the bassinet was empty. At first, Sarah thought maybe a nurse had come in while she slept. They'd been in and out all night. Maybe they'd taken him for routine checks. Or perhaps he was in the nursery, giving her a moment to rest. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples, listening for footsteps, a voice, any sign of movement beyond the rhythmic hum of machines. But the hallway beyond her door was too quiet. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, cautious and cold, as she pressed the call button and waited. When a nurse finally appeared, a young redhead with tired eyes, Sarah asked, not with fear yet, but with confusion, where her baby was. The nurse's face froze, her eyes flicked to the empty bassinet, and the room changed in an instant. What followed was a blur, a sudden flurry of footsteps, hospital staff swarming like bees, voices rising behind closed doors. Security was called. The head nurse questioned everyone. Sarah was moved to another room as detectives arrived, their notebooks open, pens scratching down her every word as she described the night, her memories, what she saw, what she heard. The door had been closed. She hadn't noticed anyone unfamiliar. No alarms had sounded. No cries in the night. Then came the footage. Around 3:40 a.m., a security camera captured a woman dressed in scrubs pushing a wheeled bassinet down the hallway. The image was grainy, the woman's face angled away, hair tucked beneath a surgical cap. She looked like a nurse, calm, efficient, unnoticed. But no one recognized her. She wasn't on staff. She wasn't in the system. And by the time they realized what had happened, she was gone, baby and all. News vans appeared within hours. Reporters circled the hospital like vultures. Microphones thrust forward as Sarah was wheeled out under a blanket, her face pale, her eyes dry from too many tears. The story spread far beyond Fairhaven. Infant abducted from hospital room. Mother wakes to find newborn gone. Police press conferences. Age progression renderings. Public pleas. Sarah on the evening news, voice cracking as she said his name. Ethan, again and again, like prayer or magic might bring him back. But days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, and then to years. Leads came and went. Sightings were reported, but never verified. A woman in Ohio. A boy in Tulsa. A strange man seen near the hospital that night. But nothing ever stuck. The case remained open, technically, but slowly faded into the dusty corners of forgotten files. A cold case, they called it. Sarah hated that term. There was nothing cold about it. Her grief still burned hot. She refused to move. While friends suggested fresh starts, new towns, therapy retreats, she stayed rooted in Fairhaven, a silent protest to the world that had stolen her son. The nursery remained exactly as it had been the day she brought Ethan home. Or would have, had she ever gotten that chance. The crib, the rocking chair, the tiny shoes she placed neatly on the shelf. The mobile above the crib never once spun. She dusted it every week. Neighbors watched her from a distance. Some pitied her, some quietly judged, but they all remembered. Fairhaven wasn't big enough to forget. Every year, on the anniversary of Ethan's disappearance, Sarah placed a candle in the window, a small white taper that flickered against the night like a whisper. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. And yet life, in its cruel and indifferent way, continued. Babies were born. Children grew. Stores opened, closed, opened again. Sarah aged, though slowly, the kind of aging that sorrow carves into a person. She worked part-time at the town library, kept mostly to herself, and walked every morning before sunrise. Some called her odd, others called her brave. To Sarah, she was simply a mother still holding out hope. 20 years passed. 20 long, aching years without answers. No more news reports. No more detectives knocking on the door. Just a name, a photograph, a date, and a love so fierce it refused to fade. Then, one quiet spring afternoon, as the scent of lilacs floated through the air outside Fairhaven City Hall, a woman named Linda opened a manila envelope and pulled out a job application. She glanced at the name, Daniel Reese. Young, recent graduate, degree in urban planning. Looking for work in his hometown, though she didn't recall ever meeting him. But it was the photo that made her sit up. She stared at the young man's face, his eyes, his jawline, the tilt of his smile, and felt the breath catch in her chest. She turned the page and scanned his date of birth. March 12, 2005. The hum of the fluorescent lights above flickered softly as Linda Marshall adjusted her reading glasses and reached for the next application in the tidy stack on her desk. It was mid-April in Fairhaven, Missouri, and the trees outside the old brick city hall were just beginning to bud. She liked this time of year, quiet, full of promise, and the job, though never exciting, gave her purpose. For the last 18 years, she'd been the gatekeeper of municipal hiring, the first to glance at resumes and make little pencil notes in the margins, stars for promise, question marks for oddities. She opened the manila envelope, slid out a crisp white resume, and began reading. The name at the top didn't stir anything at first. Daniel Reese. 20 years old. Recently graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in urban planning. Seeking entry-level work in city government. Clean formatting, good GPA, no gaps in education or employment. He'd worked summers at a surveying firm and interned with the planning department in Topeka. Neat, solid, promising. But something gnawed at her the moment she looked at the photo stapled to the back. A headshot, standard, maybe a little too serious, but there was something about the boy's eyes. That shade of blue, a familiarity in the structure of his face. She tilted the photo toward the light, studying it closer. He looked like someone, though she couldn't quite place it. She turned back to the resume, scanning down until she reached the date of birth. March 12, 2005. Her stomach clenched. She sat back in her chair, blinking rapidly. That date, it hadn't crossed her mind in years. Not since the flyers had stopped appearing on community boards. Not since the vigils had grown small and eventually vanished. But the moment she saw it, it rushed back like a flood. The panicked news coverage, the grainy footage of the woman in hospital scrubs, the town's collective grief. Ethan Whitmore, taken from his mother's hospital room in the middle of the night. The child who was never found. Linda took the photo again and studied it, harder now, the way one stares at a memory they've long tried to forget. She saw it then, the resemblance. The boy's chin, the faint cleft, the curve of his mouth. He looked like Paul Whitmore, Sarah's late husband, whose face had been printed next to their missing sons in every newspaper west of the Mississippi. Paul had passed a few years after the kidnapping. Heart attack, they said, but grief had surely hollowed him out first. Linda didn't know what to do. It wasn't her place to say anything. People sent in job applications every week. Boys were born every day. But this boy's age, his name, his face, they haunted her. And then there was the other detail that made her skin prickle. Daniel listed Fairhaven as his hometown, despite the fact that no one by the name of Reese had lived there in decades. She checked the records just to be sure. Nothing. She told herself she was imagining things. Coincidences happened. And yet, something deeper, older, stirred inside her. The same instinct that made mothers reach for their children before danger struck. She stared at the phone on her desk for a long time, debating, fingers hovering hard in her throat. Then she picked it up and dialed a number she still remembered by heart. The line rang twice before Sarah Whitmore answered. Her voice was softer now, huskier, as if years of silence had changed its texture. Hello. Sarah, it's Linda. From City Hall. I came across something today, and I'm not sure what to think of it. But I think you need to see it. There was a long pause. Not suspicious, just tired. What is it? A resume. From someone applying for the planning department. A young man. His name is Daniel Reese, and he was born on March 12, 2005. There was no sound on the other end for several seconds. Then, that could be anyone. I know. I thought so too. But, Sarah, he looks like Paul. Like a mirror. Another pause. And then the quiet, measured question. Can you show me? Linda swallowed hard. I can't send it over officially. But if you stop by, I'll make sure you see it. That evening, just before the sun dipped behind the courthouse, Sarah Whitmore walked through the front doors of City Hall for the first time in over a year. Her presence was like a breeze from another era, the kind that makes old file drawers creak and long-settled dust rise again. Linda met her at the records desk, hand shaking slightly as she passed the envelope across. Sarah opened it slowly. Her eyes locked on the photo first, and her breath caught. She stared for a long time, then whispered, "He is Paul's eyes." Linda said nothing. Sarah's fingers drifted over the page, hovering just above the ink, as if afraid the words might disappear if she touched them. He says Fairhaven is his hometown. I know, but that name, Reese, I've never heard it before. I hadn't either. Sarah looked up, and in her eyes was something Linda hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades, a flicker of something fragile and defiant. Not belief, not yet, but the seed of it, a breath of maybe. Where is he now? She asked. Linda took a breath. He starts Monday. The Monday air held the scent of damp soil and dogwood blossoms as Sarah Whitmore stood across the street from Fairhaven City Hall, her coat drawn tightly around her, though the weather didn't warrant it. She hadn't slept more than an hour the night before, her mind looping back to the face in the photograph, the name that felt foreign yet disturbingly close, and the strange chill that had taken root in her chest the moment she saw the boy's eyes. Daniel Reese. The name meant nothing. But the face, that face had not left her dreams. She stood beside the bench near the corner post box, her hands curled inside her sleeves, pretending to watch the cars pass. Her gaze, however, was fixed on the door across the street. She hadn't told Linda she would be coming. She didn't want help, or interference, or even sympathy. She only wanted to see him, with her own eyes, breathing, walking, moving. She needed to know if what she felt was real, or just the cruel fantasy of a heart too long broken. Then the door opened. He stepped out onto the stone steps with the awkward gait of someone unsure of the weight of his own presence. A slim young man in a navy button-down shirt, tucked too neatly into khakis that hung a little loose at the waist. A brown leather messenger bag hung from one shoulder. His hair was darker than Ethan's had been as a baby, but the same color Paul's had been when Sarah first met him. And then there was the walk, measured, upright, careful. Paul had walked that way. So had Ethan in the grainy home video that had played on repeat for months after he was taken. Sarah's breath hitched. The boy paused on the steps, squinting up at the sunlight, then adjusted his bag and turned left, walking slowly in her direction. She froze, unsure whether to duck behind the bench or cross the street or simply vanish into the sidewalk. But he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were scanning the storefronts, the trees, the old courthouse clock tower, as if taking everything in for the first time, like someone returning to a place they didn't realize they knew. He passed within 20 feet of her, and for the briefest moment, his eyes flicked toward hers. It was only a glance, nothing more than the natural acknowledgement two strangers give one another in passing. But in that second, Sarah felt something like gravity pull through her. A current, a vibration in the marrow of her bones. She had no words for it, no science to explain it, just a mother's knowing, a mother's ache. It was him. She didn't know how or why or what would come next, but the part of her that had refused to die, the part that had lit candles every year and dusted an untouched crib for 2 decades, that part whispered, "My boy." She turned to watch him go. He moved with purpose now, checking his phone as he walked, before disappearing down the narrow alley that cut behind the diner. She didn't follow. Not yet. Her legs were trembling, her heart thudding so loudly she could feel it in her fingertips. She needed air. She needed time. Later that day, she sat at her kitchen table, the resume laid out once more in front of her. She'd read it 100 times already, but now she studied the details like clues in a mystery. University of Kansas. Planning internship. Summer surveying work. She had a life, or at least the shape of one. A history carefully laid out. But whose history? Who were the Reeses? Why had they come to Fairhaven? And why now, after all this time? She opened her laptop and began to search. There were no public social media profiles under Daniel's name. No photos online, no birth announcements, no records of a Reese family ever living in Fairhaven. She looked up the woman in the hospital footage again, found the still images blurry, distorted, anonymous. But what if this Daniel had lived his whole life under someone else's story? Would he even know? She thought of that moment on the street again, the look in his eyes, the way he moved. She wasn't delusional. She'd doubted herself for years. She'd been told, gently, kindly, that grief played tricks. But this wasn't a trick. It was as real as breath. The following morning, she made a decision. She returned to City Hall with a fresh resolve and a polite lie. She told the front desk clerk she was dropping off documents for Linda and asked casually if the new hire, Daniel Reese, had a work schedule available. The clerk, a teenager with little interest in protocol, flipped a clipboard and said, "He's back Wednesday. Off tomorrow. Some paperwork thing." Sarah smiled and thanked him, because now she knew exactly when and where she'd be next, and she would not let him walk past her again. Wednesday arrived wrapped in the kind of golden morning light that made the cracked sidewalks of Fairhaven look like they still remembered better times. Sarah Whitmore dressed with a sense of deliberate calm that belied the storm that swirled inside her. She chose her soft blue cardigan, the one Paul used to say brought out her eyes, and the pendant Ethan had pulled from a fairground booth with a plastic claw when he was just old enough to reach the lever. Her hand shook as she fastened it, but she didn't pause. Today wasn't for fear. Today was for knowing. She arrived at the diner on Main Street a few minutes past 8. It was a narrow, timeless place with checkerboard floors and red vinyl booths, the kind of place where people still ordered coffee by the pot and waitresses knew your name before you said it. Sarah hadn't been there in years, but it hadn't changed. The smell of bacon and toast hit her the moment she opened the door. It felt like stepping into a memory, one that had somehow kept turning even after she'd stepped out of its frame. She slipped into a booth near the front window and ordered coffee from a girl who couldn't have been older than 20. Then she waited. He came in at 8:17. She watched him approach from half a block away, that same steady gait, the same slightly too careful posture. He wore a light gray jacket and carried the same brown leather bag slung across his chest. When he stepped inside, he gave a polite nod to the man behind the counter, then made his way to a stool at the far end of the bar. Sarah's hands curled tightly around her mug. He ordered something, she couldn't hear what, and then pulled out a small black notebook and a pen. He started writing, doodling maybe, notes, lines and grids. She couldn't tell. All she could see was the curve of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed when he was thinking. She wanted to cry and laugh all at once. He looked so serious, so unaware. She watched for several minutes, rehearsing phrases in her mind, arguments, introductions, excuses, all the ways she could bridge the impossible gap between what was and what might be. But none of them sounded right. None of them were enough. And then fate, with the cruel grace it often employed, offered her an opening. The waitress, the same one who'd served Sarah, tripped slightly on a rug near Daniel's stool, sending a stack of menus skittering to the floor. Reflexively, Sarah stood to help, and so did he. They both reached the girl at the same time, and in the brief confusion of bent knees and scattered pages, their eyes met again. This time, it was more than a glance. He smiled politely, said, "Thanks," and helped gather the menus. His voice was deeper than she expected, calm and warm, with a Midwestern lilt that matched the place he claimed to be from. Then his gaze lingered on her a second longer than necessary. Not recognition, no, but something like curiosity, a quiet sense that perhaps she was more than just another face in a small-town diner. "Let me help you with those," she said softly, kneeling to take half the pile. "Appreciate it," he replied. They stood together. The waitress took the menus and thanked them both before scurrying back behind the counter. Daniel gave Sarah a polite nod and turned back toward his seat. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice light, measured. "You new around here, aren't you?" He paused, half turning back. "Yeah, just started working at City Hall." "I thought so. I used to work there myself. Years ago." "Oh, really?" He smiled again, this time with interest. "What department?" "Planning and development." He raised his eyebrows. "That's where I just got hired." "Well, small world," she said, her heart thudding in her throat. "I'm Sada." He extended his hand without hesitation. "Daniel. Daniel Reese." She took it. His grip was firm, warm. She tried to keep her hands steady as they shook. "Well, Daniel," she said with the faintest tremor in her voice, "Fairhaven's lucky to have you." He grinned modestly, then checked the time. "Thanks. I got to run. First meeting of the day. But maybe I'll see you around." "I hope so," she said, and meant it with every aching part of her soul. He walked out then, the bell above the door jingling behind him. And Sarah stood, rooted to the spot, her fingertips tingling from where they'd touched his. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was something more than hope now. It was contact. It was beginning. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table once again, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows over the scattered papers and open laptop before her. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. But inside her mind, a storm was gathering force. She had spoken to Daniel Reese, shaken hands, exchanged names, but the questions still gnawed at her relentlessly. Who was this young man, really? How had he come to her town after all these years? And most urgently, could he be her son? Sarah reached for the small photo she always kept nearby, a black-and-white snapshot of Ethan, swaddled in a hospital blanket, eyes wide open as if staring through time itself. The police file, the old newspaper clippings, the hospital reports, all of it painted a picture of loss that had never quite fit. Something about Daniel's presence felt like the missing piece she had waited 2 decades to find. She opened a new document on her laptop and began to map out everything she knew about Daniel Reese. He was 20 years old, supposedly born in Kansas. University of Kansas graduate. No family listed in Fairhaven or the surrounding counties. No social media presence. His resume was thorough but clinical. No references to parents, no personal details. It was the perfect kind of anonymity that made her uneasy. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Then she typed Daniel Reese plus Kansas plus birth records. Nothing came up. No matching birth certificates, no hospital records. She expanded the search. Daniel Reese missing child, Daniel Reese adoption records, Daniel Reese stolen identity. The screen filled with results about unrelated people, news stories from decades ago, legal documents she didn't have access to. The silence was deafening. Sarah's thoughts drifted back to the woman in the hospital footage, the nervous young mother, her eyes wide with fear, whispering for help that never came. Had that woman been Daniel's birth mother? Had she managed to escape, or had she been silenced? If Daniel was taken, what story had been written over his real one? Was it possible that someone else had raised him, unaware of the life he was meant to live? She pulled out an old address book from a drawer, faded pages with handwritten names she hadn't seen in years. She found the number for Linda Reynolds, the HR manager at City Hall, and dialed. The line rang twice before Linda's warm voice answered. "Sarah? It's been ages. How are you?" Sarah hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Linda, I wanted to ask you something about Daniel Reese. The new hire." Linda's tone shifted slightly. "Oh, Daniel? He's been doing well. Quiet guy, very professional." "What?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "Do you know anything about his family? His background?" Linda paused, then said gently, "Not much, honestly. He's private, doesn't talk about his past. But from what he's said, he grew up in Kansas. No siblings. Parents, well, he rarely mentions them. Does he live alone?" Sarah pressed. "Yes, a small apartment on Maple. He seems to keep to himself mostly." Sarah thanked her and hung up, her mind racing. A young man raised alone, newly arrived in town with no family ties. It all fit too neatly with her hope. Yet she knew she couldn't act on hope alone. She needed facts. Proof. She decided to visit the local library the next day. If Daniel was living under an assumed name or had gaps in his history, Maybe public records or old newspaper archives could reveal something. The librarian, Mrs. Green, was a fixture of the town, a woman who had seen Fairhaven grow and shrink and grow again over 50 years. Sarah hoped she might know where to look. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the library just as it opened. The smell of old paper and polished wood welcomed her like an old friend. She explained her search delicately, leaving out any mention of Daniel being her son. Mrs. Green nodded thoughtfully, leading her to a section filled with microfilm readers and archived newspapers. For hours, Sarah pored over birth announcements, adoption notices, and missing person reports from 20 years ago. Names blurred together, each story a whisper of a life altered or lost. Then, buried in a dusty volume from 2005, she found an article about a baby stolen from Fairhaven General Hospital, a headline that hadn't left her memory since she was a young mother. The article described a mysterious disappearance, the police's frantic search, and a cold trail left behind. There was no mention of a suspect or resolution, but there was a small photograph, a grainy shot of the hospital corridor where it happened, and in the corner, a glimpse of the young woman Sarah had seen in the security footage all those years ago. Her breath caught. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched the yellowed page. The story was incomplete, the ending still waiting to be written. But now, for the first time in 2 decades, she felt closer than ever to finding out the truth. Days passed like slow-moving shadows as Sarah returned home, each evening with new pieces of the puzzle weighing heavy in her mind. She was cautious, aware of how fragile hope could be, but the pieces were starting to fit. The stolen baby from Fairhaven General Hospital, the private young man named Daniel Reese, the missing family ties, all whispered a story she had lived in silence for too long. But the answers she sought were still out of reach, and with every step closer, the fear of rejection tightened around her heart. One morning, as Sarah brewed her coffee, her phone chimed softly. It was an email from an unexpected source, a local genealogist named Margaret Collins, who had heard about her quiet inquiries through the town grapevine. Margaret wrote that she had access to old adoption records and was willing to help discreetly. Sarah's hands trembled as she replied, arranging a meeting for that afternoon. At the small cafe on Elm Street, Margaret greeted her with a gentle smile and a stack of faded folders. "I know this is delicate," Margaret said quietly, "but sometimes the past is kinder when uncovered with friends." Together, they sifted through documents, birth certificates, court papers, adoption files. Sarah's eyes scanned every name, every date, searching for the one that could link Daniel Reese to Ethan Whitmore. Hours slipped by as the afternoon sun cast golden rays through the window. Then, buried in a folder marked closed cases, Sarah found it. A birth certificate for a boy named Ethan Whitmore, born in Fairhaven General Hospital on the same day and year as Daniel's supposed birth date, but with a note about an unresolved custody case. Margaret's voice was soft but certain. This baby was declared missing shortly after birth. No official adoption ever completed. The records were sealed, probably to protect the family's privacy. Sarah felt her breath catch, the walls of silence around her heart beginning to crumble. This was more than coincidence. It was a thread linking the boy she had met to the son she had lost. She had to find him before the fragile fabric of his life was unknowingly torn apart. Meanwhile, Daniel's days at City Hall were unfolding with the steady rhythm of a man settling into place. He greeted each challenge with quiet determination, making a small but steady impression on his coworkers. Yet beneath his calm exterior, memories stirred, fragments of a life that didn't quite fit the story he had always known. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Daniel found himself in the city archives, digging through old planning maps and property deeds for a project. His fingers traced the faded lines, but his mind wandered back to his childhood, the flashes of faces he couldn't quite place, the faint echoes of a lullaby his adoptive mother used to hum, the unspoken questions that had lingered for years. A file slipped from a pile, landing at his feet. He picked it up, an old newspaper clipping with a headline about a baby taken from Fairhaven General Hospital in 2005. The grainy photo showed a frightened woman and a hospital corridor eerily familiar to him. His heart thumped in his chest as he read the details, the pieces of a hidden past clicking into place. That evening, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment. The clipping spread before him like a map to a forgotten place. The questions that had haunted him for years now demanded answers. Who was he really? Where had he come from? And why had his life been built on shadows? Back in her modest home, Sarah felt the weight of the secret growing heavier, but hope blossomed anew. She knew the path ahead was uncertain, full of difficult conversations and fragile trust. But she also knew that love, even when tested by time and pain, had a way of breaking through walls built by fear. As night fell over Fairhaven, two lives, mother and son, separated by years and silence, moved closer without knowing it. The threads of their stories, tangled and frayed, were beginning to weave together once more. And in that quiet, unseen convergence, there was the first glimmer of a reunion that would change everything. The following Sunday was the town's annual Founders' Day Festival, an event that drew both lifelong residents and new arrivals out into the warm September air. The streets of Fairhaven were draped in red and gold bunting, the scent of kettle corn drifting over rows of vendor stalls and laughter echoing from the old town square. Families gathered near the bandstand, children darted between hay bales, and beneath the festive mood, a deeper current of community pulsed like a shared heartbeat. Sarah hadn't planned on going. For years, the festival had been a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. The stroller she never pushed, the toddler laughter she never heard at her own home, the milestones that had belonged to other families, not hers. But this year felt different. There was something urgent inside her that refused to let her stay home. A quiet pull, a whisper she couldn't explain. She slipped on her cardigan, tied a scarf around her neck, and walked the few blocks from her house to the square. The sun warmed her back as she moved through the crowd, nodding at neighbors, barely noticing the familiar faces. Her mind wasn't in the moment. It was reaching across time, chasing a shadow that might just become real. Daniel was there too, standing quietly near a booth where an elderly man was carving wooden toys. He hadn't intended to come either, but his supervisor had suggested it would be a good way to connect with the community. So he came, wandering the booths, politely smiling at strangers, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. The newspaper clipping was folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Every time he thought of it, his chest tightened with a strange, unfamiliar ache. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of something unresolved, something important that had been buried for too long. As he leaned over to examine a toy train, a breeze carried the faint strains of an old folk song from the bandstand, a tune he couldn't name, but that stirred something deep within him. Without thinking, he closed his eyes, the melody threading through his memory like a ribbon. For just a moment, he saw a hospital room, soft lights, a woman's voice humming that very song, and the sound of muffled crying. He opened his eyes suddenly and turned. Across the square, standing near a lemonade stand, was a woman he didn't know, or at least he thought he didn't. She was older, her face lined with quiet grief and resilience, but something about her struck him like a chord. She glanced in his direction. Their eyes met for only a second, and then she looked away, shaking her head as if trying to dispel a dream. Sarah hadn't meant to stare, but when she saw him, tall, dark-haired, hands tucked in his pockets, her heart jumped before she could stop it. The resemblance was uncanny, not just in the shape of his face or the color of his eyes, but in the way he carried himself, the way he stood slightly apart from the world, watching with a quiet intensity that once belonged to her husband, Ethan's father. She felt as though she'd glimpsed a ghost, or perhaps a future that had somehow found its way back. But she couldn't act. Not yet. She didn't know what he knew, or if he knew anything at all. Forcing a meeting, confronting him now, might shatter the fragile threads of fate that were slowly drawing them together. Instead, she turned away, heart pounding, and moved through the crowd with the aching awareness that they were closer than ever, yet still worlds apart. Daniel watched her go, troubled by a feeling he couldn't explain. He didn't know her, And yet something in her gaze, not shock, not recognition exactly, but something softer, more sorrowful, stirred a question he didn't have words for. He remained where he was for a while, then bought a wooden train from the old man, paid in cash, and wandered toward the edge of the festival, where the noise faded and the past felt louder. That night, back in his apartment, Daniel took the newspaper clipping out again. He read the article 3 times, then opened his laptop and searched the name listed as the mother, Sarah Whitmore, Fairhaven. A few results appeared. One was a city record showing her work history. Another was a newspaper column she'd written years ago about healing and remembrance. And one was a picture, her picture, from a fundraising event in 2010. He recognized her immediately. His breath caught. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. It wasn't just a random woman he'd seen at the festival. It was her, the mother in the article, the one whose baby had been stolen, the one he might... No, he couldn't finish the thought. Not yet, but a seed had been planted, and Daniel knew, without fully understanding why, that he had to speak with her. Soon, 3 days passed before Daniel could bring himself to act. Each hour felt suspended in amber, every moment soaked in a nervous energy he couldn't quite shake. He went through the motions at work, answering calls, attending meetings, but his mind drifted constantly to the image of Sarah Whitmore. Her eyes filled with something between sorrow and recognition, her presence echoing in his thoughts like a refrain he couldn't silence. The name, the photo, the article, they all pointed to something monumental, something that lived at the edge of his understanding but refused to be ignored. That evening, after much deliberation, Daniel stood outside the small library near the town's west end where Sarah worked weekday afternoons. It was a modest building, whitewashed and stooped from age, its windows glowing with soft yellow light as dusk crept over Fairhaven. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, watching as a pair of elderly women exited the library with their books tucked under their arms, their conversation cheerful and light. Inside, he could see her. She was shelving returns, her movements slow and precise, as if every book held meaning beyond its pages. Daniel didn't move right away. He questioned himself a dozen times. What if he was wrong? What if she didn't want to talk about it? What if it stirred up pain best left buried? But something stronger than fear held him in place. A need to understand, to finally grasp the contours of his identity, to look into the eyes of someone who might hold answers that had evaded him his entire life. Finally, he pushed open the door. The bell above chimed gently, and the warm scent of old paper and dust greeted him. Sarah looked up from her card, her eyes landing on him with quiet surprise. She didn't speak at first, didn't smile, but there was no alarm in her expression, just a stillness, as if she had been waiting for this without knowing it. "Hi," Daniel said, his voice quieter than he'd expected. "I'm sorry to bother you. I think I came across something, and I was hoping we could talk." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached to straighten a book that didn't need straightening. Her heart had started pounding the moment he entered, and now it raced with a blend of hope, fear, and disbelief. "Of course," she said, forcing calm into her tone. "Come in. You can sit here." She led him to a reading nook near the back, away from the windows, where the shadows were soft and privacy felt natural. They sat across from each other, a small table between them, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy with things unsaid. Daniel pulled the folded newspaper clipping from his jacket and laid it on the table. "I found this while doing some research at work. I read the article, and then I saw you at the festival." His voice faltered. "I looked up your name, and I couldn't let it go." Sarah's eyes dropped to the paper. She had read it 1,000 times. She traced the headline with her fingers, as if reacquainting herself with an old scar. "I never stopped thinking about him," she whispered. "Not one day." Daniel swallowed hard. "I was adopted when I was very young. My parents told me bits and pieces. Not much. They said my birth mother couldn't care for me. I believe that. I never asked too many questions." He looked up. "But lately, things haven't added up. Not just the article. Feelings. Dreams. There's something about all this that feels familiar. Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes, but she held them back, focusing on the moment, on the young man in front of her who looked so much like her late husband had ached. "Daniel," she said gently, "do you know your birthday?" "September 2nd, he replied. 2005. She nodded, her voice barely a breath. That's the day he was taken. A beat passed between them. Time, grief, longing, all converging into a stillness that wrapped around them like an embrace neither had expected. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I don't know what this means yet. I don't even know if we can prove anything. But I had to meet you. I had to see you and ask." Sarah reached across the table, not to touch him, not yet, but to offer something small and sacred. Her presence, her steadiness, her truth. "Thank you for coming," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of 2 decades of unanswered prayers. Outside, the library lights glowed against the darkening sky, and within its quiet walls, a new chapter was beginning, tentative, fragile, and filled with the unspoken promise of healing. The days that followed were wrapped in a delicate quiet, the kind that hangs in the air when something sacred has been unearthed but not yet understood. Daniel found himself wandering through thoughts that shifted like smoke, memories that might have been his or simply imagined, feelings that bloomed without explanation. He returned to work, went about his routines, but the world had changed. It tilted ever so slightly, just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar, as if he had stepped into a life that was almost, but not quite, his own. Sarah, too, moved through those days with a strange reverence. She hadn't told anyone, not her sister, not her closest friends. Some truths were too delicate to speak aloud until they could be held firmly in hand. And this truth, if it proved to be what she hoped and feared in equal measure, could alter not only her life but his. Every morning she sat with her coffee, staring at the old scrapbook of newspaper clippings and baby photos that had lived on the top shelf of her closet for years. And every night, she looked at the sonogram photo she'd kept tucked behind a framed picture of her parents. 20 years hadn't dulled the ache. It had only reshaped it. Daniel had agreed to meet again on Thursday evening, and this time they sat at Sarah's kitchen table, a plate of oatmeal cookies between them, the smell of cinnamon warm in the air. The conversation was hesitant at first, like stepping into shallow water on a cold morning, but slowly it deepened. She asked about his childhood, his interests, his personality, the stories his adoptive parents told him about when he was little. Daniel answered, but the more he spoke, the more he realized how many gaps there were in his early life. His adoptive parents had always been loving, but vague. They'd said he came from a closed adoption, that his mother was very young, that she wanted him to have a better life. There had been no photos, no letters, no trace of the woman who brought him into the world. Sarah listened carefully, storing every detail as if trying to rebuild something fragile and half-remembered. She didn't interrupt. She didn't push. But eventually, her hands trembled just slightly as she slid an old photograph across the table. It was a picture of her holding her baby boy, wrapped in a pale blue hospital blanket, his eyes closed, his fist curled near her chest. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. His throat went dry. "I've never seen any baby pictures of myself," he whispered. "Not even one." A silence settled between them, deeper this time, not heavy with dread, but weighted with meaning. He took the photo in his hands. Something about it, some tilt of the nose, the arch of the brow, echoed in his own face like a forgotten chord finally struck again. "I want to know," he said softly. "I want to know the truth. Not just for you. For me. I lived my whole life not asking questions because I thought it didn't matter. But it does. It matters more than I ever realized." Sarah's voice cracked when she spoke. "I can't force you to believe anything. And I don't want to take anything away from the family that raised you. But if there's a way, we can be sure." Daniel nodded. "A DNA test. I've already looked it up. There's a clinic in town that does them." Sarah blinked back tears. "I'll go with you. Whenever you're ready." They made the appointment together. The clinic was quiet and sterile, the kind of place that rarely saw life-altering decisions, but somehow held the power to unlock decades of mystery. A technician swabbed their cheeks, careful and methodical, and then they were sent home to wait. The following days crawled. For Daniel, they were filled with questions that clawed at the edges of his mind. If it was true, if Sarah was his mother, what did that mean about the people who'd raised him? Had they known? Had they been part of something darker than he'd ever suspected? And if it wasn't true, if this was all coincidence, how would he live with the hollow left behind? Sarah lived those days in a different kind of tension. Every creak in the house, every glance at the phone, every knock at the door sent her heart racing. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. Her hope and fear were so entwined, they no longer felt like separate emotions. Just one throbbing ache that had lived under her ribs since the day her child vanished. They didn't speak much during the wait, choosing silence over speculation, instinctively sensing that the truth would demand its own space. But on the morning the clinic called, Daniel's voice trembled as he said, "It's in. They sent the results. I haven't opened them yet." Sarah didn't speak. She simply whispered, "Come home." And for the first time in 2 decades, that word didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a beginning. The late afternoon sun streamed gently through the curtains in Sarah's living room, casting long golden streaks across the worn hardwood floor. The air inside was still, heavy with unspoken anticipation, the kind that settles in just before a life is changed forever. Sarah sat in her armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Daniel stood by the window with his phone in his hand, the unopened email waiting like a sealed door they were both too scared to open. The moment felt suspended, like time itself had taken a breath and paused to witness what would unfold. "I guess it's now or never," Daniel murmured, his voice unsteady. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was tight, her heart thudding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it from across the room. She had imagined this moment so many times, in dreams, in quiet prayers whispered in the dark, in the long, aching hours between midnight and dawn. But no version had ever prepared her for the trembling hope that now coursed through her veins. Daniel swiped to open the email. His eyes scanned the words, the numbers, the summary paragraph at the top of the page. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked once, twice. Then he looked up slowly, and his voice came out as nothing more than a whisper. "It's a match," he said. 99.9%. You're my mother." The silence that followed was profound, not empty, but sacred, like the stillness that settles over a chapel after a candle is lit for someone long gone. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes instantly flooding with tears. For a moment, she said nothing, only sat there trembling as emotion cascaded over her in waves. Joy, grief, relief, disbelief, and something like peace, fragile but real. Daniel crossed the room slowly. He knelt in front of her, unsure of what to say, what to do. He didn't know how one was supposed to feel in a moment like this. He only knew that something inside him had shifted, as though a part of his soul had quietly clicked into place, forming a picture that had always been missing its center. Sarah reached out with both hands and cradled his face. Her touch was gentle, reverent, like a mother reacquainting herself with a child lost in the crowd. "My baby," she breathed, "I never stopped loving you. Not one day, not 1 hour." Tears rolled down Daniel's cheeks. He closed his eyes, leaning in her touch, not as a grown man, but as something deeper, as a son finally recognized. They sat like that for a long time, lost in the gravity of what had just become real. Eventually, Sarah guided him to the sofa, and they talked, really talked. She told him about his birth, the first night she held him, how his tiny hand had clutched her finger so tightly she thought her heart would burst. She spoke of the morning he was taken, how she'd gone to the bathroom for less than a minute, only to return to find the bassinet empty. The hospital had erupted in chaos. Security had locked down the building. Nurses had wept alongside her, but no trace of him was ever found. Daniel listened with growing sorrow, every detail painting the edges of tragedy that had once only been an abstract part of someone else's life. Do you think the people who raised me were involved?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe they were lied to. Maybe they believed they were adopting a child abandoned by his mother. Or maybe she trailed off, unwilling to say the darker possibility aloud. But we don't have to face that now. We'll face it together when we're ready. He nodded, grateful for her calm, her steady presence in a moment that could have felt so overwhelming. I still love them, he admitted. They were good to me, but I think I always felt something missing. Sarah offered a gentle smile. Love doesn't have to divide. It can grow, stretch, make room. That night, they shared dinner together at her kitchen table, laughing softly over memories of childhood, hers and his, trying to find overlap in the fragments. She showed him old birthday cards, a faded baby blanket, the tiny hospital bracelet she'd kept all these years in a velvet box. Every item was a thread in a tapestry that had finally begun to weave itself whole. As Daniel prepared to leave, they embraced again. No longer strangers, no longer lost. The bond between them, though new in its form, felt ancient in its depth. Walking back to his car, Daniel looked up at the sky, now darkening with the first stars of evening. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt grounded, not just in place, but in purpose, in blood, in truth. A chapter had closed, yes, but what lay ahead was a story waiting to be lived. The next morning brought with it a soft gray light that filtered through Daniel's blinds, casting quiet shadows on the walls of his apartment. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding the phone in his hand, staring at the contact name glowing on the screen. Mom. But this wasn't Sarah. It was the only mother he had known for 20 years. The woman who had bandaged his scraped knees and packed his school lunches and cheered the loudest at every one of his little league games. And now, everything he thought he knew about her was tangled in questions he wasn't sure how to ask. He finally pressed the call button, and after a few rings, her familiar voice answered. Daniel, sweetheart, how did the interview go? He swallowed hard. It went fine. I need to talk to you and Dad. Can I come over? There was a pause, brief but perceptible. Of course. Everything okay? No, not really. But I'll explain when I get there. The ride over was silent, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around your thoughts like a wool coat. Heavy, itchy, and impossible to shake off. When he pulled into the driveway of the house he'd grown up in, his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. His father was already waiting on the porch, a mug of coffee in hand, watching him with that steady gaze he always wore when something serious was coming. Inside, his mother had just set out a plate of muffins, blueberry, his favorite since childhood. She smiled warmly when she saw him, but the expression faltered when she saw his face. Daniel, she said cautiously, what's going on? He sat down at the kitchen table and took a breath so deep it hurt. Then he pulled out the envelope, still folded, still creased from where he'd carried it in his pocket the night before. He slid it across the table toward them. I found her, he said quietly. My birth mother. Her name is Sarah. She lives here in town. I didn't even know I was adopted until last week. The silence that followed was dense, suffocating. His mother's hand flew to her chest, and his father's mouth fell open, his face going pale. What do you mean? She whispered. I took a DNA test for a job, routine background stuff. The results got flagged. One thing led to another, and now I've met her. She's real. She never gave me up. I was taken. His father stood slowly, like someone who'd just been struck and wasn't sure whether to fight or run. That's not possible, he said. You came to us through a private adoption. We were told your birth mother had signed away her rights. There were documents. We trusted the agency. Daniel looked at them, both of them, his heart caught in a strange, aching tug of war. Then you were lied to, he said softly. But I need to know the truth. All of it. What did you adopt me? Who brought me to you? What agency did you use? His mother's eyes were wet now. It was a woman named Marion. She said she helped place babies with good families, ones that couldn't have children. We never thought to question it. We paid her some legal fees, filled out some forms. She said it was all handled. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the name ringing in his ears. Sarah had mentioned a nurse named Marion who disappeared from the hospital shortly after he was taken. Do you have her full name? Any old paperwork? His father nodded slowly. already rising to search through a filing cabinet in the hallway. When he returned, he carried a thin folder, yellowed, edges curled. Inside was a business card. Marion L. Connor, Family Services Coordinator. It didn't take long for Daniel to make the connection. He excused himself, stepped outside, and called Sarah. "Does the name Marion Connor mean anything to you?" he asked. There was a pause on her end, a long, stunned silence. Then she said, "Yes. That's the nurse who checked on me the morning you were taken. She disappeared the next day. No one ever found her." Daniel closed his eyes, a slow exhale escaping his lips. He turned back toward the house where the only parents he'd known were still sitting, looking like their world had just been turned upside down. He loved them. That hadn't changed. But now, tangled among the love was grief, confusion, betrayal. Not necessarily from them, but from the people and systems that had brought their lives together under false pretenses. Back inside, they spoke quietly, honestly for the first time about things that had long gone unexamined. His mother wept, not just for the guilt of what they hadn't known, but for the fear that he might walk away. His father placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder, eyes brimming. "You're still our son," he said. "That hasn't changed, but we'll help you find the truth. Whatever it is." Daniel nodded, heart heavy and open. The story of his life had been rewritten in days, but the ending was still his to write. And now, he wouldn't be writing it alone. Daniel spent the next 3 days buried in courthouse records, faded newspaper archives, and old medical board bulletins, driven by a restless need to piece together the last fragment of his stolen past. The name Marion Connor became a mantra, something he murmured to himself late at night, as if repetition might summon her from wherever she'd vanished to all those years ago. There was little online, just a few scattered mentions in nursing rosters from the late 90s, and a single black-and-white photo in an archived hospital newsletter, grainy but unmistakably her. Sarah confirmed it over the phone. "That's her," she whispered. "That's the woman who walked into my room the morning you disappeared." The image haunted him. Her short, neat hair, that thin-lipped smile, and the knowledge that this woman had somehow slipped through every net left Daniel with a hollow pit in his stomach. He made his way to the old county hospital, now converted into a rehabilitation center, and stood in the hallway where it had all begun. The walls were different, the tiles newer, but the bones of the place remained. He found the director, an older man named Harold Bergman, who had worked at the hospital during the same period. She was one of the float nurses, Harold said, adjusting his glasses and pulling a clipboard closer. Came in for night shifts mostly. Quiet. Professional. But after that incident, the baby who went missing, she never came back. We assumed she left town. I remember they investigated, but nothing came of it. No charges, no trial. Just vanished. Daniel pressed harder. Did anyone ever find her? Family? Friends? Address? Harold shook his head slowly. Her file had a home address in Pine Hollow, about 50 miles north of here. A small farm property far out in the hills. But the authorities said the place was empty when they checked. She was gone. Pine Hollow. The name curled around Daniel's thoughts like smoke. He drove there that same afternoon, the road narrowing the farther he went, swallowed up by trees and rusted mailboxes, until he came upon a crooked lane marked by a sun-faded sign that read Connor Lane. He followed it until it ended at an old farmhouse, long abandoned, its porch caved in and vines clawing up the siding. He stepped out of the car, boots crunching gravel, and stood there for a long time, imagining her returning here after taking him, rocking in a chair with him bundled in her arms like nothing had ever happened. Inside, the house smelled of rot and dust. The furniture was still there, mildewed couches, a rocking horse missing one eye, yellowed curtains that barely stirred. He moved slowly through the rooms, feeling like he was trespassing not just on land, but on memory itself. Upstairs, in a bedroom with peeling wallpaper, he found what he hadn't dared hope for: a box. Tucked beneath floorboards half lifted by time, the old cedar chest was filled with brittle papers, photos, and notebooks. And right on top, in a cracked plastic folder, was a birth certificate with his name, his birth date, and Sarah's name listed as mother. His hands shook as he pulled it out. Below were photos. One of him as an infant, unmistakable even in the faded light, resting in the arms of a woman with the same gray eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. But behind that, tucked into a spiral notebook stained with water damage, was something even more startling. A list. Names. Dates. Amounts of money. At least a dozen entries. It wasn't just him. Daniel staggered back, breath caught his throat. This wasn't about one stolen child. This was a ring. A pattern. A system. He snapped photos with his phone, trying to capture every name and figure. Then he called Sarah. I found her house. She's gone, long gone. But she kept records. I wasn't the only one. There was a pause. You're saying she did this more than once? Yes. And she documented it. Like it was business. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, voice low and certain, we need to go to the authorities. Together. That evening, Daniel returned to his parents' house, the box in his arms, his face drawn with everything he'd seen. He sat on the table and opened it before them, one by one laying out the pieces. His mother covered her mouth, gasping softly when she saw the birth certificate. His father stared at the notebook, jaw tight, rage simmering just below the surface. People need to know, Daniel said. This woman, she didn't just take me. She might have taken others. And those families deserve to know what happened. His father nodded. We'll stand with you. Every step. Later that night, Daniel drove to Sarah's house, the box between them on the coffee table like a shared altar to the pain they'd endured. She reached across, her hand covering his, tears welling. You've done more in a week than I could in 20 years, she said. You found her. You found the truth. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them held something sacred. Grief, yes, but also healing. The pieces were falling into place. The path ahead would be hard, but he no longer had to walk it alone. The morning light crept softly into Daniel's room as he sat hunched over his laptop, the weight of discovery pressing heavily on his shoulders. After nights of restless thought and endless calls, he had finally made a decision. He would take the evidence to the local police, to the media if necessary, and unearth every secret that Marion Connor had buried in silence for 2 decades. This was no longer just his story. It was the story of countless families who had been robbed of their children, left with only unanswered questions and aching voids. He dialed Detective Harris, the only officer who had shown genuine interest in his case when he first approached the police. The detective's voice was calm but alert, a tone that carried the promise of action. Detective, I have something you need to see, Daniel said. Documents, photos, records, proof of what Marion Connor did. She didn't just take me. There are others. Harris arranged a meeting at the precinct that afternoon. When Daniel arrived, he was met not just by Harris, but by a small team, a forensic accountant, a child welfare investigator, and a seasoned reporter from the local newspaper who had caught wind of the story through an anonymous tip. The weight of the moment was palpable as Daniel laid out the papers, explaining each entry, each name, each date. The investigators exchanged looks that spoke volumes. This was the break they had needed. The reporter, a woman named Claire, clicked her pen thoughtfully, already sensing the impact this story would have on the community. Within hours, the news had spread like wildfire. Families came forward, some hesitant, some desperate for closure, each with their own story of lost children and unanswered prayers. The town's peaceful veneer cracked, revealing a deep well of pain and betrayal that had long been ignored. Daniel found himself thrust into the spotlight, not as a victim, but as a voice for the missing, the forgotten. He gave interviews, answered questions, and shared his story with a raw honesty that touched hearts far beyond the borders of his small town. Meanwhile, Sarah watched from her home, her own heart swelling with a complicated blend of hope and fear. She had lived with the quiet torment of what might have been for 20 years, but now, thanks to Daniel, the past was rising, demanding justice and recognition. The investigation moved swiftly. Authorities tracked down leads to other towns, other states, unearthing a network of illegal adoptions, forged documents, and complicit officials. The name Marion Connor became synonymous with betrayal and deceit, a dark chapter in the history of child welfare that would not be forgotten. But amidst the turmoil, Daniel's relationship with his adoptive parents deepened. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it was tempered by their unwavering love and support. They had raised him with kindness, not knowing the truth, and now stood by him as he sought to make things right. One quiet evening, Daniel sat with his adoptive mother in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She reached over and squeezed his hand, eyes glistening. "You're doing something important," she said. "Not just for you, but for all those children who never got a chance." Daniel nodded, the weight of responsibility settling firmly on his shoulders, but balanced by a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't just reclaiming his past. He was building a future where truth would prevail and no family would have to endure the silence he had known. The town, once a place of quiet acceptance, was now awakening. The shadows of the past were long, but with every story told and every truth uncovered, light crept steadily in. Daniel's journey, born of loss and confusion, was becoming a beacon of hope, not just for himself, but for all those who had been touched by Marion Connor's dark legacy. As the days passed, Daniel and Sarah met more often, their bond growing stronger through shared pain and healing. They navigated the complexities of newfound family ties with care and respect, mindful of the love that had shaped Daniel's life, while embracing the truth that was finally coming to light. In the end, Daniel realized that identity was not just about blood or birthright. It was about the connections we choose to nurture, the stories we tell, and the courage to face the past so that the future could be brighter. The day Daniel had long dreamed of finally arrived, wrapped in a gentle spring sunlight that seemed to bless every step he took. Standing in a modest courthouse of his hometown, he was surrounded by faces both familiar and new. Family friends, neighbors, even strangers who had followed his story through the years. But most importantly, he was with Sarah, the woman whose life had been forever intertwined with his in ways neither of them could have imagined back in those lost, uncertain days of childhood. Today was more than a legal formality. It was a celebration of truth, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that time and circumstance could never sever. The judge looked kindly upon Daniel, a man who had journeyed through unimaginable pain and uncertainty, and granted the final confirmation. Daniel was officially recognized as the biological son of Sarah and her late husband. Tears filled the room as the weight of years lifted from their shoulders. For Daniel, this recognition was a healing balm, a piece of the puzzle finally fitting into place after a lifetime of searching. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out into the courthouse steps, exchanging hugs, laughter, and tears. Daniel's adoptive parents stood close by, their hands clasped tightly with his, eyes shining with pride and love. They had raised him as their own, and nothing, no paperwork or secret, could ever change that. The past was complicated, but the future was wide open, filled with promise and the warmth of belonging. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Sarah worked together to reach out to others affected by Marion Connor's web of deception. They organized community meetings, partnered with child welfare agencies, and spoke openly about their journey in hopes of bringing comfort and closure to those still searching. Their story became a beacon, inspiring others to seek their own truths and hold on to hope even in the darkest times. Sarah shared memories of the boy she never stopped loving, the son stolen from her arms but never from her heart. Daniel listened, absorbing every word with reverence and gratitude. They began weaving together the tapestry of their shared past, connecting lost threads, healing old wounds, and creating new memories rooted in honesty and trust. Daniel's life shifted in profound ways. He found a renewed purpose in advocacy, dedicating himself to helping families affected by adoption fraud and child abduction. He traveled to conferences, spoke at schools, and worked closely with law enforcement to prevent future tragedies. Through this work, he met countless people who carried pieces of his story within their own lives, a testament to the far-reaching impact of one stolen child and the ripple effect of justice. Yet amid the public victories, the quiet moments with his adoptive family remained his sanctuary. Sunday dinners, shared stories by the fireplace, laughter ringing through the house. These are the true gifts that reminded Daniel who he was beyond the headlines. Love had raised him, truth had given him freedom. Both were essential to the man he was becoming. In the evenings, Daniel often sat on the porch with Sarah, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. They talked of dreams long deferred and hopes newly kindled. The past, with all its pain, had shaped them but no longer defined them. Together, they embraced a future where healing was possible and love, in all its forms, endured. As spring blossomed into summer, Daniel took a quiet walk through the fields near Sarah's old farmhouse. The place where Mary and Connor had hidden her secrets now felt like ground sacred and reclaimed. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could give way to new life. He thought of the boy he had been, the lost infant taken from a hospital room, and marveled at the journey that had led him home. It was a path lined with sorrow and discovery, but also courage, connection, and unwavering hope. Daniel knew that while the scars of the past would remain, they no longer dictated his story. He had reclaimed it, piece by piece, and in doing so, had forged a legacy not just for himself, but for all who had been touched by loss and found their way back to love. The night sky stretched wide above him, stars shimmering like distant promises. Daniel smiled, heart full, knowing that the greatest gift was not simply finding his origins, but creating a life rich with truth, compassion, and belonging. The journey had been long, but at last he was truly home. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this heartfelt journey. Stories like Daniel's remind us all of the incredible power of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family, no matter how lost or far apart we may feel. If this story touched you, inspired you, or brought up memories of your own, please don't hesitate to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you and keep this conversation alive. And if you enjoyed this video, please give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories that move the heart and soul. Your support means the world and helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Until next time, take care, stay hopeful, and remember, you're never alone in your journey.